Story 1. The Unseen Visitor. Jake, Mark, and Sarah had been planning a weekend camping trip for months. Their destination, an isolated patch of dense forest nestled at the foot of the Appalachian Mountains. The area was infamous among locals for its eerie stillness and unsettling wildlife activity, but for the group, it seemed like the perfect place to escape the chaos of everyday life. Armed with tents, sleeping bags, and supplies, the three set off early one Friday morning. The drive up the narrow, winding roads was long, but the view was breathtaking. Towering trees surrounded them on all sides, their branches casting long shadows over the forest floor. They arrived at a secluded clearing just before dusk and quickly set up camp. There was no cell phone reception here, but that was part of the allure, a chance to disconnect completely. After building a fire and eating dinner, they settled in for the night, their laughter fading as the stars filled the sky. By midnight, the air had grown cold, and an eerie silence settled over the forest. Not even the rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl could be heard. Sarah was the first to notice something was off. Lying in her tent, she suddenly felt as though she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Listening intently, she heard the faintest sound, a soft, steady breathing, just outside her tent flap. She bolted upright, her heart racing. "Mark? Jake?" she whispered into the darkness, but there was no response. Mustering the courage, she unzipped her tent and poked her head out, shining her flashlight around. The campfire had died down to embers, casting a dull glow over the clearing, but nothing seemed out of place. The next morning, Sarah confided in the others, but they laughed it off, attributing it to nerves. However, as the day wore on, the unsettling feeling remained. They spent the day hiking, but every so often Sarah swore she could hear footsteps behind them, faint but distinct, like someone, or something, was following them through the underbrush. When she told Jake and Mark, they brushed it off, claiming it was probably just an animal. But deep down, Sarah knew better. That night, as they huddled around the campfire, the feeling intensified. The air seemed to grow heavier, and the forest, once peaceful, now felt oppressive. Mark, ever the skeptic, stood up to stretch his legs and ventured out into the dark trees, claiming he needed to use the bathroom. Minutes passed, and when Mark didn't return, Jake and Sarah started to worry. "Mark?" Jake called, his voice tinged with concern. There was no response, just the deafening quiet of the woods. After another 5 minutes, they decided to look for him. Armed with flashlights, they ventured into the forest, calling Mark's name. A few yards in, Sarah's beam caught something, a set of footprints, but they weren't Mark's. The prints were too large, deep, and spaced too far apart, as though something massive had passed through. Then they heard it. The same soft breathing Sarah had heard the night before, only this time it was right behind them. They spun around, but their lights caught only empty space. Their hearts pounded as they ran back to the camp, only to find Mark sitting by the fire, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "I saw something," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Something watching us." They didn't stay to find out what it was. Abandoning their campsite, the trio packed up in record time, racing back to their car and vowing never to return. Whatever had been in those woods, it wasn't human, and it hadn't wanted them there. Story 2. The Cabin in the Woods. Lisa had always been an adventurer. When she heard about a remote cabin deep in the Pacific Northwest, she couldn't resist. The locals warned her it was cursed, but Lisa didn't believe in such things. The idea of an isolated retreat appealed to her, a place to write, relax, and disconnect from the world. So, armed with her journal, a few provisions, and a sense of excitement, she set off into the wilderness. The cabin was ancient, built of weathered logs and surrounded by thick forest. It stood on the edge of a small clearing with no signs of human activity for miles. Inside, it was dusty and dim, but otherwise cozy. As the sun began to set, Lisa lit the lanterns and settled in for a quiet evening, enjoying the sounds of nature outside. But as the hours passed, those sounds changed. The cheerful chirps of birds were replaced by something much more unsettling. A low, guttural growl echoed from the woods, followed by the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. Lisa froze, her heart racing, but convinced herself it was just a bear. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously peered out the window. The beam illuminated only trees and shadows, but the noise continued, growing closer. Suddenly, the cabin door rattled as though something had slammed against it. Lisa jumped, backing away in terror. The door rattled again, harder this time, and then a loud, unnatural scream pierced the air. It was like nothing she'd ever heard, a mix between a human wail and the screech of an animal. Lisa grabbed a knife from the kitchen, retreating into the back corner of the cabin. The door banged again and again, but it didn't open. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence. Terrifying. Absolute silence. Lisa didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, for fear whatever was out there might return. The next morning, when the sun rose, Lisa bolted from the cabin, abandoning her things and sprinting back to her car. She never told anyone what had happened, but deep down she knew. The locals had been right. There was something in that forest, something that had been there long before the cabin, and it had no interest in sharing its home. Story 3. The Whispering Pines. Brandon and his younger sister Emma had been camping in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey for as long as they could remember. The dense, sprawling woods were their favorite place to escape, and their parents' rustic cabin was the perfect spot for a weekend getaway. It was an old family tradition, passed down from their grandparents, and they knew the woods like the back of their hand. On this particular trip, however, something felt different. From the moment they arrived, there was an unsettling quiet in the air. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, seemed muted, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. On the second night, as they sat around the fire, they heard it, a whisper, faint at first like a soft breeze rustling the pine needles. But as the night wore on, the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice, a woman's voice, calling to them from deep within the trees. "Brandon! Emma!" it said, the voice ethereal and chilling. The siblings exchanged nervous glances. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Brandon nodded, his heart racing. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the woods, but saw nothing. "We're just hearing things," he said, trying to convince himself as much as Emma. But the voice continued. "Come closer." It beckoned, growing more insistent. "Come into the woods." By now Emma was shaking. "Brandon, let's go back to the cabin, please." Brandon agreed, though he tried to hide his own fear. As they made their way back, the voice followed, growing louder and more aggressive with each step. The trees seemed to close in around them, the path twisting and turning in ways it never had before. It was as if the forest itself was trying to trap them. Finally, they reached the cabin and bolted the door behind them. But the whispering didn't stop. It echoed through the walls, filling the room, no matter where they went. All night they listened to the voice, unable to sleep, as it called to them from the darkness. The next morning they packed up and left, vowing never to return. To this day, neither Brandon nor Emma can explain what happened that night. But they know one thing for certain. Something lives in those woods, something that whispers, and once you hear it, it never lets you go.